we're all set. And then just after the presentations, when it's time for questions, all that we do is we ask that you guys come up and speak into the microphone just so everyone online can hear you. Okay? All right. You're up.
So you say I got to talk into the mic?
Yes, sir.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm going to stand a little bit to the angle here. So my name is Louis Bernasconi. I work at the Indian Health Service out of Reno. We are the Phoenix area Indian Health Service, and I work with the Division of Sanitation Facilities Construction. We'll be discussing our overall program, funding these last couple of years, what we've gotten this year, what qualifies, what doesn't qualify for our program, and who we serve. All right, next slide. It's not working again. So what I'll go over, like I mentioned a second ago, I'll also go over our mission and how we actually have the authority to develop MOAs with the tribes. And we can go to the next slide. That's fine. So we get the authority for our program under PL 86-121. It created our program, SFC, and it was created in 1959. Essentially, it gave us the authority to develop a relationship with the tribes one-on-one. So it gave us the authority to come into a memorandum of agreement with the tribes. So in the 90s, under the Clinton administration, 94-437 was the Indian Improvement Act. Oh, it was actually during the previous administration. It created our one congressional mandate to develop the SDS system. So that's our one congressional requirement, is to maintain a sanitation deficiency system. And that's how we fund our projects, which we'll get into here in a minute. So we try to make sure that we're collaborating and partnering with the tribes when we're developing projects. I see one group that we work with out of our Reno office here. Our main job is to maintain that SDS list, so maintain that inventory. So we're going out into the field, meeting with tribes, meeting with utility departments, meeting with the people on the ground, and finding what's actually wrong with their systems. So along with that comes with our environmental engineering services. We help develop the projects from cradle to grave. So we would identify a need for a project. We're out in the field, and then we find a solution to that project, usually through a preliminary engineering report, which is all required now for pretty much all funding. And then we actually provide the funding for those facilities. And once we get the funding, we're able to do the professional engineering design and the construction services kind of throughout the entire project. Other things we do is we advocate for the tribes when they're relating with EPA or with other kind of governing entities. So if they have a dispute with a city or dispute with EPA, we try to advocate for the tribes on any kind of environmental engineering, public health issues. Another half that we pay for is a utility type consultant. So that would be, I'm not sure who's too familiar with Indian Health Service programs, but we call them our ducks and tucks. So our utility consultants. And they go out to tribal utilities and provide technical assistance in the field, along with providing different trainings. And we have very little emergency response services. We tend to kind of stay out of this area, but we have responded. In 2017, there was a flood out in Pyramid Lake, and we were able to provide some technical assistance during that flood event and get their water system back online within a couple days. So IHS is made up of 12 different areas. Like I said, I'm based out of the Phoenix area here in Reno. The part that isn't shown here is we serve all the tribes in Owens Valley. So we serve all the way down the 395 corridor from Owens Valley down to Death Valley. California area, as you know, is just all of California. And I believe Chris Brady talked earlier in a different presentation in the California area. So the very first sanitation facilities construction project was in Elko, Nevada. It was in 1959 or 1958. Essentially, it was putting in watering points. So we drilled wells and put in hand crank pumps and put in outhouses. At that time, I think the federal government illegally entered into a relationship with the tribes out there. And so that was what led to the passage of 86-121, so that they could actually have the ability to go into the MOAs with the tribes. So what kind of projects are we talking about? We're talking about water, wastewater, solid waste projects. Here's just a general photo of projects we've done across the country. We have a photo up there from Navajo, a photo in Bemidji in the bottom right corner there. I'm not too sure where the other two are from. So water, wastewater infrastructure. We also do solid waste projects. So transfer station improvement types projects, and that's all based off of what are they called? Integrated solid waste management plans instead of a PER. So what kind of funding do we provide? We fund housing for homes. We serve homes essentially. We don't serve commercial entities. We don't serve tribal buildings. We don't serve any kind of connection that's not a home. And it has to be a permanent residence, and it has to be a tribal member. So housing is our bread and butter. That's all we are allowed to serve under congressional mandate. We have two different types of funding typically. So we'll talk about our special projects fundings here in a minute. Normally we have housing funds where we're able to serve homes kind of like scattered. So we have an individual that we're going to do a septic system for, or a individual well for, and we get separate funding for housing. And then we also get regular project funds, which is for more community type projects. So if there is a need for a water treatment facility or a solid waste facility. Special projects. So we do fund special projects here and there. So different studies we've funded in the past. We're working on an O&M project right now with the Big Pine Pike Tribe, putting all their system into GIS and seeing how that goes. And then we do these special projects to figure out if we need to get more federal dollars in to fund those things kind of nationwide. And so they kind of pick projects here and there. Emergency projects. Like I said, we don't dabble in too much. In years past, it's been $1 million for the entire country allocated for it. I'm not sure what it is now, and it requires our SFC director's approval. So that would go right to our headquarters director. So these last few years have kind of changed our program. We've gotten more money than we've ever seen in years past. So in 2020, we got CARES Act funding, and that money had to be spent by the end of the year. In Phoenix area, we successfully were able to do that, I believe. I know at least in our district, in Reno district, we were able to spend all that money. And then we got ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act in 2021. So that's early in 2021. That provided, I think I have the numbers here in a few slides. So that provided quite a bit of money. And then the IIJA, also known as the BIL. I actually didn't know what that was when I was prepping for this. So yeah, we call it IIJA and IHS. So it's just, I guess, just different agencies calling it the same thing. So I already talked about this. We have two primary funds, housing funds, regular funds. We go to the next one. Oh, we go back one. Yeah, there we go. So I'll iterate a little bit more on our housing funds projects. So has anyone, just kind of a show of hands, worked with IHS? Okay, so sanitation facility construction specifically? Okay. So we have our housing funds. We get that. It's a 10% increase every year. So I think Phoenix area as a whole last year got, was at 4.4 million. This next year, we're going to get, 4.8 million. And it just builds 10% every year. It's a congressional increase that we're allowed to get every year and ask for every year. So we get these funds to fund new and like new homes. So like new, I view that as like a 15-year or more years livable in a home. We'll look at the roof, look at the condition of the windows, the siding of the house, and that sort of thing. So it doesn't have to be a brand new home for us to serve it. We like to focus on BIA HIP homes. That tends to be the most neediest people. And then we go kind of in this funding order for spending our housing dollars. This last year at a Reno district, which is the state of Utah, Nevada, and Owens Valley, I believe we served about 100 homes, individual homes. So kind of gives you a size and scope. Out of our Eastern Arizona district office on Hope land, they've served a similar amount. So another set of funds is regular funds. So it's based on everything based on the SDS. So the SDS gives us our total need of sanitation facilities to be constructed. And essentially we have a scoring system, which I'll go into in a minute, and there'll be a cutoff line. This last year was our first year where we actually didn't really have a cutoff line. If it was a tier 1 project, we were able to fund the entire project, the entire list. So that was a new thing for our program. I think this year we were not going to be able to say that we can do that. I think the need has been determined to be greater than the available funds. So it's kind of an expectation, but we could get in that in a minute. So national overview. So we can kind of see our increases in I think this is just need, right? Yeah. So we see a gradual increase, and I think what I'm going to do in this presentation in the future years is build kind of a graph. I saw some people that had a graph earlier. I think it was you, kind of showing like the last 20 years, and I think that would be valuable to kind of see of need versus actual funding, and kind of see where those are actually meeting now. So we can go to the next slide. So 2019, 2020, we had the same appropriation. The one thing I kind of wanted to point out on this slide is the increase in partnerships. I think specifically with EPA and other tribal partnerships with tribes funding portions of it. We go from 40 million from outside agencies or tribes to 80 million. And if you go into the next slide, we go from 80 million to 132 million in 2021. So I think that goes hand in hand with, the ARPA money that was out there, because we were able to use that as contributions from tribes. CARES Act money that tribes also gave in for contributions for projects. So yeah, 2021, we got a lot of money, and 2022, we've gotten even more money. So 2022 IIJA funds, we received or got notice that we are going to receive $3.5 billion over the next 5 years, 700 million per year. So last year, 700 million was the exact amount, what was on the tier 1 projects to be funded in SDS. And so we were able to fund all the projects that were tier 1 in SDS. And we'll get what tier 1 means in a minute. There you go. Stay on that one there. Yeah. So you can kind of see we went from 192 million, and then in 2021, on top of our 192 million, we got the 167 million, and then now we're getting an additional, up to 700 million. Along with that comes a 3% for administration funds. So what we're getting there is it's for temporary employees. So we're not allowed to hire permanent employees with this money, and then we're also not allowed to use this money for regular staffing. So what we're trying to do right now is make sure we're able to administer these funds. And so now the OIG is also going to be getting a small chunk, about, what is that, 17.5 million a year to keep an eye on where these monies are getting spent. So we'll actually have a person, I believe, in our Phoenix area office overseeing the administration of the funds. All right. We go to the next one. I think I updated the next slide. Yeah, there we go. So I just was showing the years in progression. I think what I'm going to do is that table thing. I think that I like that. So this year we received in Phoenix area. So we don't have national numbers yet for actual distributions to different areas. That doesn't come out until November 30th when we have our snapshot for Congress. So I only have Phoenix area data for this. So in Phoenix area, we received 27 million, and 23.3 million of that was regular. And actually, I was wrong with the housing. So 6.7 million in IIJA. That money went up pretty high. So we could compare that to the years past. We've gotten a lot more money than we've ever had before. And you can see too, with the ARPA money, the 11.5 million, more than doubled, or more than our total allocation of 2021. So we were able to fund an additional 14 projects last year that we probably wouldn't have funded with ARPA funds. Yeah, so IIJA, we're going to be bringing in a ton more money, and what we can look at is the SDS. Yeah. So what we look at in SDS is how do you have a tier 1 project? I'm sure that's probably the main question out here. We update projects annually. We work with EPA and other agencies to develop these projects. A lot of times EPA will come in and help us pay for PERs, preliminary engineering reports, so that we can get a project to actually be a tier 1 project. So we take this list every year on November 30th, take the snapshot, present it to Congress, develop the need, and then get the budget for the next year. So we kind of talked about our typical projects, and I think most people know what kind of projects we work on. We could go to the next slide. So how do we score the projects? The biggest thing right now is health impact and deficiency level. So you'd work with your local IHS engineers to kind of work those out. For like an example, say there's a sewage lagoon that's actively discharging outside of a fenced area that has public health exposure. That would be like a health impact score of 18, deficiency level of 3, and then everything would be documented. We used to really push the O&M capability score because that was what tribes could really control, and we still push it a lot, but nowadays it's more important to just have the documentation of need, and we're more likely going to fund it. So in 2019, we kind of developed this new tiered system. Tier 1 means it's ready to fund. It means it has a completed preliminary engineering report or equivalent documentation of a preliminary engineering report. Or if it's a solid waste project, it has an integrated solid waste management plan with a proposed project actually in the integrated solid waste management plan. A tier 2 level project is typically a project that has funding for a PER, and we're currently working on developing that PER to get it to a tier 1 process. And a tier 3 is, we got a phone call from a tribe saying we have 5 breaks on a water main and we have 0 documentation. We'll list it as a tier 3, and knowing that next year, hopefully we'll be able to collect that documentation, improve the need, and then get it to a tier 2 if we need to do an engineering report, and then eventually to tier 1. So right now our main focus is getting all of our tier 2s and 3s raised up, because last year we funded all of our tier 1s. So the big thing is working with the tribes to get this documentation. Without the documentation, we can't fund it. There's been a lot more scrutiny. So with the OIG kind of looking at everything that we're doing now, we really have to make sure that we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's, and records and documentation are key. So whatever the tribe can provide to us that we can put into the SDS system and share as much as we can and justify the need, we'll be able to get that project up to a tier 1 and actually get it funded. And we could say that kind of more with confidence. Before, we'd have to say maybe we would fund it, and now we could kind of more confidently say we'll likely fund it as long as there's a shown health impact and deficiency level need for the project. So that's the biggest thing the tribe can do is provide that documentation. Last thing is strategizing with tribal priority points. So if the tribes have multiple projects on their list, let's focus on putting those priority points to our projects that are actually going to get funded this year, and then perhaps attack other projects the following year. So we have offices everywhere. If you need questions or any questions on who to reach out to, your local IHS office, you could reach out to me. My information was on the first slide, I believe, or I have a card here I could share with you. And yeah, there's actually a typo on my next slide. Phoenix. So, so yeah, reach out to me. And do you have any questions, or are we going to hold questions at the end?
I think we have time for questions now.
Okay.
People have questions for Louis.
Questions?
Don't make me come up. I'll talk really loud, I promise.
The people
I can
online,
repeat-
the
I can
people
repeat-
online can't hear you.
I'll repeat the question.
But yeah, there-
I don't remember, if you have tribal homes off Rancheria, do you still fund those? Or do they have to be on trust land?
Yeah, so the question is, if homes are not on trust land or federal land, can we serve them? And the answer is yes. So as long as the land is owned by the individual or has rights to that land, then we're allowed to spend housing funds on those homes. Any questions? Oh, yeah.
I had a question about your criteria. Can you talk a little bit about what you factor into O&M capability? And I'm wondering if you put financial capacity or any kind of financial assessment as well.
Yeah, so we have a district utility consultant that performs sanitary surveys. And I think in California, actually, I think we're unique, right? I think we're unique in that our utility consultants do all of the sanitary surveys for Nevada and Owens Valley and not Utah. Region 8 does Utah. So in that sanitary survey, our utility consultants go through a checklist and look at different criteria of the utility. So we look at if they bill, that's one of the criteria, and then if they have actually collect a water bill. We ask if they have a budget, and then we score it based on that. We ask if they feel supported by their leadership and management. That's another one of them. Do you recall that there's making sure that they're certified water operators. I think there's 5 criteria. It's not what I do normally, so I don't know right off the top of my head. But yeah, we look at all those aspects, and then charge for water is always one. We look at all those, and then we kind of normalize it across the area, so that we're trying to be fair within Phoenix area, so that our utility consultant in Reno is doing the same thing as our utility consultant in Show Low, as our utility consultant in Tempe, and making sure we're normalizing those numbers across the area because we're competing against projects across the area, and then we develop a score from that.
One more question here.
Okay, I'm aware that in California, you have funded some projects for allotment lands, which are trust lands, but the residents in that case that I'm aware of were not federally recognized tribal members. But is there any help at all for tribal people who do not live on trust lands but are also not members of federally recognized tribes? Because there are needs for those kinds of situations, especially with drought.
Yeah, it's a good question. So we have a government-to-government relationship with tribes. We go into MOAs with the tribes directly. So if a person isn't supported by that tribe or a local tribe, then we wouldn't be able to serve that person, unfortunately.
In other words, it has to be a federally recognized tribe, or?
Yeah, we'd have to be able to enter into an MOA with them, a memorandum of agreement.
How about a tribal nonprofit that's not a federally recognized tribe? I'm thinking of specific situations.
Yeah, I don't know if there would be a mechanism for that. That's something I personally haven't dealt with. I know that we do have a government-to-government relationship, so a lot of times we'd be working through a chairman. And if it's not a federally recognized tribe, I don't know how we would come up with an agreement to spend the money on it.
Well, if it's a tribal nonprofit, it's an organization. It is an organization. Anyway, just.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'll ask around and see if there's anything out there. But yeah.
And we have a question from the online audience.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we have Audrey, and she's asking, homes in rural areas on a reservation who have no connection to water lines, are they eligible? Or do they have to have water lines connected? Yeah, I'll repeat it. So homes in rural areas on a reservation who have no connection to water lines, are they eligible? Or do they have to have water lines already connected?
So I guess the way I'm seeing it is it's an individual home that's on a piece of land that doesn't have a water service line or a water system around it. So yes, we serve rural homes all the time. We drill wells and construct septic systems. So yes, we can drill wells in rural areas, and we've recently increased our budgets on those types of connections as well. So we've been seeing the cost of everything go way up. So we've been raising our prices with that.
Okay, good. Did we have any other questions? Okay, so maybe we'll have time at the end for other questions if you think of a question for Lewis, but I'll go ahead and present for EPA. I'm Nancy Sockabasin. I'm a member of the Tribal Drinking Water Team / office at EPA Region 9. A couple of my colleagues are here, Emmanuel Rapacavoli, and I thought I saw Andrew Salek come in too. So just wanted to introduce them as well. So we want to focus this session. We've had these sessions at past conferences, and we've talked generally about our drinking water and clean water infrastructure funds, but the BIL funding that we have this year has kind of overwhelmed what we've had before for resources. And so we wanted to focus on that this year. So the two things I just would say is that the funding that we're getting this year is this year and probably for the next 4 years is more than 3 times what we've received recently. So we want to make sure that you're aware of that. And then we're also moving into consultation for those new build programs, and we really want your input on those. So just those are the two main takeaways. We also have everyone should have received these. We have some flyers just generally about our programs. And then we also have the letter that I'll talk about later, which is our early engagement letter for consultation that will come later this year for the build programs. So to get into the presentation, the bill was signed last November, and it includes $50 billion to strengthen the nation's drinking water and wastewater systems, and almost 900,000 or 900 million of that nationally is to address longstanding tribal drinking water and wastewater infrastructure needs. There was an implementation memo that was sent out, and that basically those are the guidelines for how we're going to implement these programs going forward. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, so you may have seen a version of this chart in other presentations, but this just shows you the bill funding over the next 5 years. This year, we received $38 million for the general supplement for the Clean Water Indian set aside. That was for projects that were prioritized in consultation with IHS. So we worked very closely with them to fund projects and spend that funding this year. And then we also had emerging contaminants funding for Clean Water Indian set aside. That funding was available to us, has not yet been utilized, and so we're going to be utilizing that funding in FY23. And then there's just the additional funding for drinking water. The supplement that we received nationally was $38 million. And then for emerging contaminants and lead service lines, which are the 2 programs that are new that we'll be consulting on later this year. And just to show you in Region 9 where the money went this year, we received almost $12 million for the clean water supplement, and for the base funding we received $7 million. So that was just for clean water for this year. We were awarded over 41 million, or we awarded over 41 million in FY22, and that supported about 48 projects, including some projects in the border area and some projects that we funded with wind funding as well. We also awarded some emerging contaminants funding this year for drinking water, and we have yet to award lead service line funding, and I'll talk a little bit about how we're going to do that in the future. So the new programs that we have, the first is the emerging contaminants funding for drinking water. These, although there's an emphasis on PFAS, we're really looking for information about other contaminants that might be a priority for tribes. Any of those projects that are on the CCL list, which is the contaminant candidate list, are eligible for funding under this program. We also have an emerging contaminants for small and disadvantaged communities program, which is, there's about $6 million, I think, that will be available this year. And the big difference with that and the other emerging contaminants funding is just the community that it serves needs to be less than 10,000 people. The other funding that we have is lead service lines, and this is really where the bulk of our funding is. And at the moment, that funding needs to be used specifically for lead service line replacement or planning for those projects. We can also use that funding for developing lead service lines and we have a session tomorrow, I think it's at 3:45, where Jason Gambatese will be talking about how to do those lead service lines and what we're planning to do with that. But this funding can be used for those replacements. In the West, we're not expecting that we're going to find a whole lot of lead service lines, but we're still going through that process to determine that, and we'll see what we come up with. Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, I can repeat it.
so is this going hand in hand with the slide that we saw at the previous water one, where it's talking about a line inventory?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the question was whether or not this was the same funding that Tomas Torres had talked about earlier in the Water Division Director panel, and it's the same funding. And I'll talk a little bit more about like what feedback we're looking for from tribes on how we're going to prioritize these projects.
Another question.
Yeah.
And this covers just the service line, not the service connections, right?
So it's a service line, and I think we added, there was like the small,
Okay.
yeah. So the question was whether or not this is just lead service line, and the answer is it also includes lead containing goosenecks, pigtails, connectors, things like that. Okay, and then the last portion of funding is the clean water emerging contaminants funding. This funding is actually going to be still managed out of our headquarters office. So we'll be focused on consulting with tribes on the funding that we'll be implementing in Region 9. So the emerging contaminants for drinking water and the emerging contaminants for the small and disadvantaged communities, as well as a lead service line. We're looking for input on emerging contaminants for clean water because this is kind of a new program for us. So we have asked a few questions about that in the early engagement letter as well, and we welcome comments for that. Okay, so just quickly about the consultation. So we sent the early engagement letter out last week that was sent from Tomas Torres, our division director, to all tribal leaders, and you should have been copied if you're environmental directors. We also sent it to utilities, IHS counterparts, and things like that. If you don't have a copy and you want one, it's here. We also have it, I think it was uploaded onto the tribal or the conference website too. So we're going to initiate consultation in December. We'll have a 90-day consultation period, and then we'll conclude consultation in February. So in between December, February, we're planning some webinars, maybe some one-on-one meetings with tribes. We'll also be attending the February RTalk, and we'll have coordination meetings there as well. And then we're hoping to finalize our project prioritization criteria in April, and that's around the time that we're making final funding decisions on all of our funding. So for our new funding, the BIL emerging contaminants funding, these are just some examples of the projects that we can fund. So completing pre-development activities for PFAS projects and other emerging contaminants, conducting some sampling, as long as it's not routine and compliance sampling, we can do that as well. And then designing projects to address PFAS, so the actual treatment of drinking water for emerging contaminants. And then for small and disadvantaged community emerging contaminants, it's similar as far as the projects that can be funded, but this program also can provide household water quality testing, including those unregulated contaminants. Yeah. Has it come up? Is that what you're asking? Sophia was asking about a specific contaminant. Okay, so that's a contaminant that has been associated with coho salmon die-off, and whether or not that's been on the list. That hasn't been highlighted to us. I don't know if it's on the CCL list. Yeah. So if it's not on the CCL list for drinking water, then it wouldn't be considered an emerging contaminant for EPA. But for clean water, it's kind of wide open. And so we can talk a little bit about that one. Okay, so for drinking water, the input that we've requested, and this is all in the letter that was sent out last week. So we're looking for specific types of projects that should be considered for funding or prioritized for funding. Do we want to fund, consider prioritizing construction over planning? Things like that are what we're looking for feedback on. And then other than PFAS, that's already been highlighted as a priority through this program, but what other classes of emerging contaminants should we prioritize? And are there criteria for that prioritization that you would be interested in EPA considering? And then we've done a regional sampling program for PFAS. We've sampled 50 tribes, I think, for PFAS in their drinking water. And potentially there's other emerging contaminants that people may want us to consider for another regional sampling program. That's something we do with contractors. RCAC helped us go out and do that sampling, no cost to the tribes, and the work is actually done by our contractors. So we could potentially open up another program like that as well through a contract. And then just considerations for how we're going to prioritize the level of contamination. Do we want to look at the MCL and the health advisory? And if so, will there be levels of, it's already over the MCL, that's going to be prioritized versus something that might be approaching an MCL or a health advisory? Those are the types of things that we're looking for. Okay, so for lead service lines, again, developing or updating lead service line inventories, that's something that's going to be required of most tribes to do, and mapping those lead service lines that are also fundable under this program. I will say that one of the things that we're really trying to do, especially with the lead service line work, is utilize a headquarters contract to do a lot of this work. So we wouldn't necessarily be awarding grants to individual tribes to do some of this work. Those resources, it might be too resource intensive for tribes. If it isn't, then we're open to looking into IAs or grants, but primarily a lot of this work will be done through the contract. And then providing technical assistance to small water systems and conducting non-routine lead sampling. So as long as it's not for compliance, we can do additional testing. So again, what we're requesting input on is just considerations for receiving assistance to that EPA-directed contract for planning and replacement of lead service lines. Any other resource needs that you may have to plan, scope, and oversee the construction of these projects. Again, that's something we could potentially do under the contract as well. And then specific criteria that EPA should consider when prioritizing the construction activities. Should we require that the lead service line inventory is completed, whether or not there's planning documentation? It may not be as specific as a PER, but there should be some planning documentation included. So those are the things, again, that we're looking for. And then lastly, emerging contaminants for clean water. And the one thing to note about this, if you're familiar with our programs, the Clean Water Indian Set-Aside Program, we've always used the SDS list. The only projects that we could fund were on SDS. We worked very closely with IHS to fund those projects. For this emerging contaminant funding, the projects do not need to be on SDS. And so it's a little more wide open. The contaminants are less specific. We heard earlier this week even talk about potentially lithium mining and some concerns related to that. That's a possibility for sampling under this program, as well as any other contaminants that may be associated with that mining. So but we can fund our monitoring for purposes of identifying where the emerging contaminants are. This is a new thing, I think, for EPA and many tribes, as far as just knowing what contaminants are out there in wastewater. And then identifying and supporting preliminary engineering activities related to these projects. So again, we're requesting input, and right now we're requesting input that we'll provide to headquarters as they're making their determinations about how to prioritize projects, but specific types of projects to be considered. Like I said, contaminants, with this project, this program, they don't have to be on SDS. So we could prioritize non-point source pollution projects or other projects that we haven't traditionally funded. And so that's one thing that we would want to consider. And then emerging contaminants that are of concern to tribes that may benefit from a regional sampling program. Like I mentioned, the PFAS sampling that we did for drinking water, we could do something similar for wastewater. And I don't know if anyone was in the wastewater surveillance training that just took place in the room next door, but things like doing sampling for COVID and polio viruses and things like that. That's also something that could be considered for funding.
What about the
fire retardant?
PFAS, like PFAS components, yes. Yes.
Like that, the cleaning up of that, that's okay.
Yes, so what we would need to do first is probably figure out where the issues are. So the sampling programs would come first, but if you know that you have an issue specifically for PFAS or other contaminants, and can show that, then we can move into the treatment process and the treatment construction. Okay, yeah, we can definitely talk about that. Okay, we may need to talk maybe with our Superfund folks about that, because I think it might be a different program, but we can talk about that. And the question was related to PFAS that might have been found on the ground versus in the water and trying to avoid it getting into the water. Okay, so then what I wanted to let you know, so for the clean water funding and the supplemental clean water funding, all of that will go through, will need to be funded through the SDS list. Everything that's clean water, other than the emergent contaminants, has to be on the SDS list. So we just want to provide you with those contacts for the clean water funding. For the drinking water funding, we're going to fund all of our projects through the solicitation that was sent out in September. So you should have received an email about this. We're accepting proposals through November 30th. Last year, I think we received 29 proposals for about $43 million. And I think we ended up awarding about $22 million for drinking water specifically. And I think there were like 24 projects that we funded for drinking water. So make sure that your projects get into our proposal list by November 30th. All projects related to drinking water set aside, but also emergent contaminants for drinking water and lead service line projects will all be funneled through that program and that solicitation. And that's the website there for more information. The one thing to note is that we have a lot more funding this year. And as you may know, that the drinking water set aside funding, we have a criteria already that we've developed, health ranking criteria. And so we're looking for projects that might rank lower. Some of the higher projects that we fund are usually like water supply deficiencies and where there's contamination over an MCL. And so those projects are usually prioritized. We usually fund most of those projects that are in those categories. But projects that are lower on the list that would usually be below our funding level, we may be able to fund those this year. So projects like addressing contamination that's approaching an MCL, we may be able to fund those projects this year. Replacing transmission lines and distribution lines where there's not a water supply issue, but there's a need to replace those lines. And then security measures for your water system, funding roadways and construction to provide access to a water system, that's all fundable under our program, and we may be able to fund projects that are ranking lower like those funds this year. We also currently incentivize projects for those that are serving fewer than 30 gallons per person per day, those that are in severe water shortage conditions, and those are always prioritized, and we usually get to fund those. There are some things that are climate resiliency projects that we don't always get to, but we might want to consider this year, and we may have funding for this year. And those are things like water efficiency projects. So putting in meters or putting in SCADA so that you can better determine your water levels for the year. And then the last thing is just implementation of backup water storage and water sources. So you may have a water source that has been pretty reliable, but you have questions about whether or not that will be reliable into the future. And so those types of projects normally wouldn't rank high, but they are fundable, and we're hoping to fund some of those projects this year. And then lastly, just a quick reminder, our solicitation has been sent out. Proposals are due November. We usually will review those proposals, send ranking letters out in early January, and then we'll expect responses to those back in March and make our final decisions in April through July. That was a little delayed this year, just due to all of the new funding that came in, but trying to award all of that funding that we've talked about, that $70 million by July, September timeframe is what we usually try to do. A lot of the BIL funding is no-year funding, so it will carry over to the next year, so we will have that funding available if we don't have the projects this year. Hopefully we'll have more projects next year to fund. And then just lastly, I'll leave you with some contact information. This is for IHS, since we work so closely with them, particularly on the clean water projects. This is the contact information for each of the each of the IHS areas within Region 9. And then these are our drinking water contacts. If you have questions about a project that you want to fund, please reach out to the Drinking Water Program Manager to talk about your project. They're more familiar with your individual systems, but if you have general questions about any of these funding programs that we've talked about today, just feel free to reach out to me as well. I think that's it that I had. I'll leave that up there in case anyone wants to copy down their contact. But did anyone have any questions, either for me or remember questions for Lewis? Yes.
When you say sampling, does that mean paying for lab results?
Yeah, so we can, there's a couple things we can do. We can, if there's a sampling program that we put forward and you wanted to get samples taken, we would do the sampling, we would send the results to our laboratory, we would get the laboratory results back and then provide those to you. Yes.
Go back to the slide that showed the process. So I have a question. On the top left, it says EPA issues grant to tribe or IA drinking water service. So does that mean that projects funded under this program don't have to be on the SDS list? That tribe can actually apply for this money directly?
Yeah, so the question, yeah.
I was confused about what.
Yeah, so the question is whether or not drinking water projects need to be on SDS, and they do not. For drinking water projects, we do the separate solicitation, we ask for projects, and sometimes they're on SDS and sometimes they're not. So as long as you submit to us a proposal, we can consider it for funding. For clean water projects, so the wastewater projects, those projects have to be on SDS, and so the best thing to do there is to contact IHS and get that project on SDS. Any other questions? Any thoughts on any of the input that we're requesting? Any initial thoughts about either contaminants that you might want to consider? Prioritizing projects that you have in mind that might be an emerging contaminant funding project that you want to know if maybe we can fund?
I got a general question about that. If you're funding things outside of IHS, is the tribe going to be actually doing the work then at that point? Or are you going to do A&E firms or environmental engineering firms on the side?
Yeah, so it's kind of open right now. I think if a project's for clean water, if a project's not on SDS, we most likely wouldn't work with IHS. And so we're probably going to be using grants for tribes, but we really want to focus on using that contract that's available through headquarters as well, because they can do a lot of the work for tribes. And we can also potentially set up sampling programs like our PFAS sampling program, so that work would be done by EPA or another contractor as well. But as far as the construction, if we get to a point where we're finding lead service lines and we're doing construction, that construction can be done by tribal utilities or tribal entities that may be doing construction already. So we can, yes, force accounting. That's what Lewis said.
Did I hear correctly yesterday that this bill funding has to be spent in 3 years?
No, I'm not sure what bill funding they were speaking of. There may be some bill funding that has to be spent within 3 years. So our funding, it's no year money. So FY22 funding is still available to us if it wasn't spent. FY23 funding will be available this year. And it doesn't have to be spent by 2026, which is when we'll get our last allocation. I think we have some time even after that to spend all of this funding. Yes. Oh, that may be the EJ money. The EJ bill money, maybe? Okay. So there's potentially funding under the Inflation Reduction Act that has to be spent in 3 years, but this bill funding for infrastructure does not have to be spent in that time frame. Are there any questions on the, nothing online, okay. Okay. Well, if there's not any other questions, we can give you, it's 10 minutes back to you. If you have specific questions, I want to talk to either myself or Louis, feel free to come up. Oh, and handouts? Is that? Yeah, handouts are here if anyone needs them. Okay, thanks, everyone.